the roll real quickly for the Planning Commission. Mr. Anderson. Mr. Carter.
Here.
Mr. Grant. Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Mr. Merritt.
Here.
Mr. Norton.
Here.
Ms. Pace.
Here.
Ms. Pratt.
Here.
Ms. Stubblefield.
Here.
All right, thank you guys. We have a quorum, so we're going to kick this off. Thanks again for City Council for joining us for this joint work session. And thank you for the folks from Dominion Energy. You're the stars of the show, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. This mic here at the end is free for your use. And Kat will be helping with the slideshow, so if you just let her know when you need a new slide, we'll go from there.
I'm Jennifer Hightower with Dominion Energy, South Carolina. I'm in governmental affairs, I'm your local municipal liaison. And I want to introduce the folks that I have with me this evening. I have Danny Cassis, who is in charge of all of our customer relations and renewables. Bill Turner oversees our electric operations for our entire service territory, and Paul Fisher, who is in our public affairs media relations group. We met with the mayor last week, or I met with the mayor last week and staff, and just thought this might be a good opportunity to give you guys a better understanding of what we do, why we do it, and then just some background information on the undergrounding of utility lines. And forgive me for having my back to you guys. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Danny and Bill.
Thank you all. Good evening. My name is Bill Turner. I work in electric operations for, I was going to say SCE&G, but now Dominion Energy. The presentation that we have for you tonight is an abbreviated version of one that Danny and I did just about 4 or 5 months ago, back in September, that we did for the Public Service Commission. And they had similar questions, I think, to what you have tonight. So we shortened that somewhat, and so I can shorten it some more. So if you'll give me a signal that we need to speed up, we can certainly do that. We can stay here all night if you want to and talk about tree trimming issues and underground and that sort of thing. So we are at your disposal. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to come to the group. We've had numerous opportunities such as this to come and explain the situation, the when, the why, the where, that sort of thing. Typically, what we will do, starting when we do have a cycle trim within a municipality, we will meet with either the mayor or his or her designee to go over and explain exactly what's going to be trimmed. I've got some of these specifics in the presentation here, and a little bit typically of what we would show when we do that. Now, depending on the municipality, they may want to put that on their website or pass it along to residents within the town or city. It's just really up to you as to what you do, but we're certainly willing to share with you drawings or that sort of thing so that everyone can know what is about to happen. And typically, we also are going to send some type of notification to the customer at the physical address so that they know that we're coming. And this it typically happens 3 to 4 weeks prior to the trimming starting. So there are numerous opportunities for communication that can occur prior to the trimming starting. And if necessary and if requested, we'll do a public meeting similar to this here. We do it in open format so that anyone can come in between 2 or 3 hour time period and ask questions about tree trimming. So that's available to you as well. So I'll get you to advance, if you don't mind, to the next slide. So without question, our top priority is safety. Now we can break that down into a lot of different things, but the safety of our employees as well as the safety of the general public. And that could be a customer, it could be somebody just walking by, it could be a visitor from out of town. So if we do that top bullet point properly and correctly, then the next 2 bullet points are going to follow. And those are reliability and resiliency and in customer service. We have found that over time, this is absolutely the most important thing that we do. The fact that our employees go home in the same condition that they came to work in. And it's just like any municipality that has employees, whether it's fire department, police department, public works, anyone on staff at a town or city within our service territory. Safety is absolutely our number one priority. Okay, I'll let you advance to the next one, please. All right, so just general bullet points here about vegetation management, AKA tree trimming. So you can call it a number of different things, but critical without question to the reliability of the system. In the event of storms, whether it be an ice storm, hurricane, tornado, whatever it might happen to be, it also allows for faster restoration because we don't have all the vegetation that's in the right of way that needs to be removed first, or it needs to be moved off of wires, conductors, poles, pad mount transformers, that sort of thing. Obviously increases safety for employees and the general public. On our distribution system, a couple total numbers here, but this is throughout the state of South Carolina for Dominion Energy. Almost 13,000 miles of overhead lines that we maintain. There's another figure, I think Danny's got it a little bit later on in his presentation. I think it's about 5,800 miles of underground conductor. And those are typically maintained on a 5-year cycle. Our transmission system, which you can see part of this as you're on the way to Folly Beach, but these are the taller, higher voltage lines, typically on steel poles, ones on James Island coming toward Folly Beach. Some of those have been changed out to steel. The others will be changed out to steel very soon. So from a transmission standpoint, actually James Island is served very well from a transmission of backbone standpoint. So these are the lines that provide bulk power from the generating plant to substations. So the first substation as you're going back into town toward James Island, towards Charleston, is James Prelo, is what we call it, which is on the left. There's actually a road called James Prelo Road. Kind of a side point here, but as we negotiated the sale of that property, that was one of the things that it had to be named James Prelo. So we said, okay, we're going to name it James Prelo. But that is the closest substation to Folly Beach, and so it's obvious that we have to maintain that vegetation around the transmission lines. That's the first thing. That's the most upstream asset that we have, providing power to Folly Beach, and then the distribution system is below that at a lower voltage level. So about 3,700 miles of overhead transmission line. And those, depending on where it's located, because some of those right-of-ways are extremely wide, so that's why you see the variability there in the cycle of 4, 5, and 6 years. Okay, go to the next slide, please. So specific to Folly Beach, so approximately 20 miles of distribution line that we maintain here on a 5-year cycle, last trimmed in 2015. We're a little bit late on the cycle now. But it just depends on how things kind of play out with our contractors and other trimming projects that we have. It might be plus or minus just a little bit. Lewis Tree is our contractor. We have sent notifications out, and that the notifications to the individual customers is either in the form of a postcard or an email. It depends on whether that customer has selected to be paperless or not. So that's what determines how that notification is provided to the customer. Typically, debris, anything that we trim is removed on a daily basis. There have been some exceptions to that, just depending on the amount that they get generated, or maybe if it's bridging over on a weekend. But generally, it is removed on a daily basis. All right, so we think we're going to finish in April, which will put us in good shape for upcoming hurricane season. We do have some palmetto removals. You've probably seen some press coverage prior to this, where we've talked to the city of Isle of Palms, town of Sullivan's Island. On Saturday, Danny and I were with the mayor and some of their staff members talking about palmetto removals downtown. I got a picture of why this is so important a little bit later on in the presentation. But next trim cycle will be in 2025. You can advance to the next slide. All right, so this is a layout circuit diagram of the overhead facilities on Folly Beach. You may see some breaks in here on the conductor. If that's the case, then there is some underground in the area. We didn't show that on this particular slide. I think as most of you know, we have placed some of the facilities on Center Street coming onto the island underground. The substation that serves a lot of the front beach on Folly Beach is behind us here, I think over a block behind me here. And so those underground cables feed into that substation. We got 2 of them for redundancy purposes, one on either side of the street that come in. So we try to separate those to prevent a dig in taking out both of the cables. So that's the reason that you may not see anything right there in the middle. But that's the bulk of the 20 miles of distribution trimming that we have queued up for Folly Beach for this year. And you can advance to the next slide, please. So the folks that we have on staff that are directing our contractors are degreed foresters. And typically this is where we have gotten from. It's from Clemson and NC State, just because those are typical universities that have this program. They are also registered within South Carolina, and they're also certified arborists as well. And they also have a pesticide application license, because we do herbicide placement as well along our rights of way. And okay, now you got me covered. This is a diagram that Paul Fisher, who's here with us tonight, helped me work on. But this is a good graphic that shows our visually what our trimming specs are. Now, I will say that we use Ansi A300, which is a specification that our contractors are trained in. And in some cases, these numbers that I have on the screen, and you'll see there's a number of minimums around that, and I'll go into detail because I know it's tough for the folks behind us to see. But we may not get right on that line. So if we go up to a tree and we measure 10 feet across and we just cut in a straight plane, more than likely that's not going to be something that's healthy for that tree. So it may have to be a little bit more, or in some cases it may be a little bit less than that, but the tree has got to be analyzed first, and the folks that do this on a daily basis know this very well. But so, for example, I've got what we call a 3-phase pole on the left and then a single-phase pole on the right. And you'll see examples of this throughout the island, where we've got 3 primary conductors up top. So 2 would be on the cross arm, and 1 would, in most cases, is going to be at the top of the pole. The one on the right is just going to have 1 conductor, and it will be on what we call a pole top pin at the top. But typically these specs are 10 feet on either side of the outermost conductor, which would apply to the picture on the left. The other one is just going to be 10 feet on either side of the center line of that pole. 20 feet above, there's some cases where it makes sense to go ground to sky, is what we call it, because we've got a good bit of overhang, and maybe in the past we've had dead limbs and that sort of thing come out the top and drop down on the conductor. And then on the bottom, we go from the neutral and we go down 4 feet. There are some situations where we may have equipment at the base of the pole, like a down guy, for example, on the picture on the left, where we will need to do maybe a radius around that down guy to clear it, or maybe clear some vines off the pole. And then on the right-hand side, there's a service wire coming off. And service conductors are trimmed for abrasion only, which means about a foot around each of those conductors. What we're trying to do is keep the limb from rubbing on the conductor and potentially rubbing the insulation off the wire and causing a short circuit in it, which is going to put a hot conductor on the ground. So typically these are the specs, but there are some cases where we may have to deviate from that. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, but this is one thing I was indicating to you is Ansi A300. So we'll use this as our spec, and I've got some graphic pictures here to describe it to you so you can see what I'm talking about. But this is a very common standard used by many of the electric utilities in the United States. It takes the health of the tree and makes that one of the first and foremost concerns when we're doing trimming in this manner here. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I think this is our specs here in graphic and kind of detail, but I guess it can maybe be summed up as this is directional type pruning. So, and there are guidelines in here that tell our contractors the best way to trim for the health of the tree and to take these cuts back to the main leader. Now, in some cases it is okay to leave that leader. It does depend on the species of the tree and what it's going to sprout. It also talks about the type cut that we have, and so a couple of no-nos here that we do our best to avoid, and it does depend on the situation and the tree and exactly where the conductor is in proximity to the tree. But the two things we're trying to avoid are flush cuts and stub cuts. Now, flush cuts basically what it is described as, but it's cutting too close to the main leader. The limb that you're trying to cut, you're cutting it too close to the leader, and a stub cut is the actual opposite of that, so you're cutting it too far away. It's very difficult to fix a flush cut. We can't put the wood product back on the tree. We can fix a stub cut if we can get in the right position and get the saw and the bucket at the right location. So the thing that our foresters are doing prior to and after trimming is making sure that our crews know the general area where they're going, and at the end of the trimming cycle that we do a follow-up, and we do basically a punch list. We're going to do an inspection, and we're going to go back, and if we have stub cuts or anything that needs to be either additional cuts that might need to be made or stub cuts that need to be done right, then we ask our contractor to come back. So it's just like you're building a house or you have a building project that you're doing. You're going to do an inspection. You're going to do a punch list, and the contractor's going to come back and fix any issues that are remaining that need to be resolved. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So just a couple of pictures here in the presentation that Danny and I had. We had more pictures than this, so we got a pretty good bit of them, but I didn't want to spend too much time on this. I know you've seen some of this in the past, but if one thing that we have the benefit of doing is if you look at the two pictures on the right, they're separated in time. And so we're able to go back on Google Street View and see what these cuts look like back in time. So in some cases we can go back as far as 2010 and maybe even back further than that. So this is the same stretch of Savannah Highway, and this is near Burns Downs over in Charleston. And so these are separated, I think, by 2 trim cycles. So the reason that we put these pictures up here is that it shows that when you give a tree time to grow, and typically this is going to be 5 years, and when we come back and cut it, obviously that tree is growing over time and starting to fill out and flush out, and you get used to your surroundings, and when we come in and cut, it's like it changes in one day. And it is like a very close haircut many times, and we understand and appreciate that this is something that is rather quick. And so someone may go to work one morning and come back in the afternoon, and the trees have been trimmed. So we do understand that. We know it's in many cases a shock to a homeowner or property owner to come back and see something like that. But the thing that we're trying to avoid is the picture on the left where we've got a conductor and it's so close to that leader that it's bouncing up against that leader and it's causing arcs, embers, that sort of thing to fall from the tree. Go ahead and advance one more. I think this is the palm tree that I have. So, palm trees are a little bit different than a hardwood or a pine or something like that. So we do have to pay close attention to that. And I know, obviously we've had conversations with the Isle of Palms, and that is their signature tree, and that's the main, one of the main reasons why people love it so much. And palm trees are a part of Folly Beach as well. But this is what we're trying to avoid here. This is one that has been involved in an arc situation. It was allowed to grow taller than it should have grown, and this is what we're trying to avoid with these type of trees and this type of contact with our high voltage overhead conductors. So, the palm trees, they don't grow very fast. They may be 3 to 4 inches per year. And basically you look up there at them and they look like they're harmless, but they are growing. The part of the palm tree that is really the heart of the palm is the bud at the top. So if you go up and you damage that bud, you're going to kill the tree. The rest of the tree is just a big old straw, is all it is, and it's drawing water out of the ground and it's supplying nourishment to the top of the tree. So everything in a palm is up top, so you really cannot directionally trim a palm tree. The only option there is you got to do away with the wire or you got to remove the tree, one or the other. So they just cannot coexist in the same spot. It does depend on the species that is planted there. Some palms, like a Washingtonian palm, is going to grow extremely tall. Way taller than the conductor or the pole line is going to be. Standard palmetto trees that you see in and around the Charleston area are going to be in this general height range, which is about 40 feet or so. So we are going to have some palms like this that'll be in conflict on Folly Beach, and that's what we're going to have to talk to you about. The ones that we were talking about in Charleston on Saturday, we had about 170 trees that we're talking about down there. I don't think we're going to have that on Folly Beach, but we are going to make a list and we'll talk to you about it. Now, some of those will have to be removed. Some of them can stay depending on the height of where they are, and we'll put them on a list for a later cycle. But there will be some high priority palm trees that we are going to have to address so that we do not have a situation like this. Get you to advance one more. So Danny, I think this is going to start yours. So we can do this a couple of ways. We can let Danny do his presentation. I'll obviously be here, and then we can do questions at the end if you'd like to do it that way. I'll leave it up to you as to what we do. It's probably best if we go ahead and get Danny up here and go ahead and do his the second part of the presentation. So we're about on 25 or so minutes, and Danny's probably about in that same range with his as well.
Bill, thanks. Yeah, Danny Cassis. And so I run our renewable strategy, but also I work with Bill and help him. So I'll do the piece on the undergrounding. So the reason why we do this together is I think people essentially correlate tree trimming, and then they think of mitigation and how do we address the aesthetics, and then undergrounding is a natural conclusion. So it's actually we kind of get into some of the truths and then some of the myths about undergrounding, and then how we actually build and maintain and operate our system. And that includes when undergrounding works, why it works, and what it takes to make it happen. So we measure everything, but one of the most important things we measure, and it goes back to what Bill said before about what our priorities are. So after safety, then you saw resiliency, and then you saw reliability. SAIDI is the number of minutes of outage that you have. So we measure it for all our customers. So we have the ability to know not only when customers go out, but how fast we can restore them. So the classic definition of reliability centers around minutes of outage, and then resiliency is when power goes out, how long does it take to restore it? How quickly can you bring it back safely? people automatically equate undergrounding with operational improvement in those areas. What I will tell you is that having done it for 30 years, and Bill having done it for probably a couple more years than me, there's an advantage and there's a disadvantage. But it's a pretty, in the end of the day, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Undergrounding is more expensive, but it provides you some de-risk against events like wind. It is very bad when you have rising water events. Floods, water and electricity don't work very good together. So it creates a balance. So these are the same conversations that we have in almost every jurisdiction that has the risk of rising water and in wind. So those are two of the things that we deal with. We'll get a little bit into the restoration, which will be on the next couple of slides. But so what we're trying to balance is how fast can we restore your service? How can we keep it from going out? And if it's going to go out, how fast can we put everything back together? So I've lived in Charleston all my life. Bill has been the operations manager and lived here almost all his life. So we lived through Hugo, both of us. So we know what the force majeure event looks like. I was in the gas department, actually was down the street restoring gas service in 1989 because the washout and the ocean met each other and the gas line was disrupted. That's what happens on underground utilities in an extreme water event. So it's a little more complicated than let's just put it underground. So that comes from a lot of experience and having to rebuild it a lot of times. That is kind of where we draw our reference point from. Next slide. Yep. So this stuff, we actually have to report this stuff to the regulator. Because the two things we get actually judged on, one is cost of service and the other one is adequacy of service. So it's got to be priced right, but it's also got to be, the one thing that we can get in trouble for relative to other than cost is if your service level's not good. So if Bill's not cutting the trees and his team's not doing their job, then the service level goes down. We get as many complaints about outages and minutes of outage and blinks and those type things. It's around that metric, that SAIDI metric. But you can see our improved history. It's a function of keeping the trim cycle what it is, keeping it at 5 years. We know that works in an environment where we've got a really aggressive growing season. 300 days of growing season in South Carolina. That's not how it grows in other jurisdictions. Somebody said once, you can trim it like we do in New York. Well, they got a 60-day or 70-day growing season. We got 300-day. So it's a really, really aggressive growing season you got to deal with. Okay, next slide. Yep. So we're obviously highly informed about the history that we've seen in our jurisdiction. And my eyes are really bad, but I'm going to tell you those are all the events that we've seen in South Carolina. I would describe most of them as relatively minor events, not major force majeure events, but you can see our ability to create reasonable restoration even with the smaller hurricanes. Part of that's a function of what Bill said before. There's clearing around the lines. We have access to them. We can get the crews out. We have the ability to bring a lot of people in and put a lot of emphasis on completing the restoration. But that's a function of, and you can compare it to the way other states have performed that haven't been as appropriately focused on vegetation management, and it takes a lot more for them to get the service back up. That's important to us. That's important to y'all. Especially it's important when you've got things like a pandemic going on. You want service back when you can get it. Next. Yeah, so here's a classic. I think on this storm, Bill probably remembers the exact statistics. We got, I don't know, Bill, 75-mile-an-hour winds, and yeah. So every place that had the different growing season but didn't have a vegetation management, this is a site that we go to that actually has all the outages in the United States of America and every utility, and it basically keeps track on it if you go to that website. So you don't ever want to be in the red. And so that's actually almost all those states had an outcry of how long it took to restore service. And the one thing we noticed when we looked at all the pictures and talked to folks that were up in the region, they didn't do their vegetation management. And that's what and they vowed to cut trees from that point forward, but they deferred it and decided not to do it, and that's what they ended up with. Next. Yep. So here's our statistics, just to give you a little, and I'll repeat a couple things, but they're worth repeating. So we have 69% of our system, our distribution system, is overhead. It is flexible. It's easy to work on. Our linemen have access to it. They can see it. When there's something wrong with it, they know what to do with it. They're able to work it energized. There's a faster repair time. They get it back up. It is subject to salt contamination, which is a negative. And we're susceptible to what I would describe as wind events. So that's a negative. Most people think of force majeure events or forces of nature, and they think of wind. But I wouldn't only think of wind on the coast in South Carolina, and we know that from our experience. Okay, next one. Yep. So underground, it's a little over 5,000, so we got 31% of the system. So it's a good diverse mix. The challenges on the underground is, some of the stuff that we described, but you got to work it de-energized due to its inflexibility. You're typically having to take it out of service and to determine where the failure is. You really need to create redundancy, which is what drives the cost up, because a lot of times you don't have the reasonable amount of time to repair it, so you have to have an alternate path. So, and most people don't realize, but almost everything that's underground, it's fed by something overhead. That's how it gets to the underground. It's highly susceptible to water events. So you have less frequent outages, but it's an extended time to repair it when you do have to repair it. So for those who don't think it ever goes bad, I think that Bill and I could probably start listing really bad experiences we've had over our career where you've had underground, and you tell somebody it's a 12 hours, it's 15 hours, it takes a long time to make those repairs. So it also requires above ground equipment locations. You've got to physically have a place where you have cable that comes up, so you've got to be able to operate your system. You've got to be able to close switch, open switch, access it. You can't replace poles and not have some other piece of equipment that electrically works. The advantage is the aesthetics piece. It allows you to eliminate poles and eliminate wires, and it does allow for some vegetation, although you can't block the above ground pieces of pad mounted equipment because we have to have access to them. So you can put stuff around them and you can shield them, and we try to work on the technique, but we got to have access to it. Yep, next. Yep. So over the course of time, the technology's gotten better, and so there is a natural conversion of the assets to create a mix of overhead to underground. There's another slide that comes up later. You don't have to move it yet, but it'll show how much work we've actually physically done during, and most of it, all of it's really in both of our careers. But in order to convert, it takes equipment locations. It takes the actual legal right to be where we are with the assets, whether it be the pad mounted equipment or the cable or whatever. It takes the redundancy, because you don't want a single radial where it's one line, especially when it's underground, because if it feeds a lot of customers, it doesn't give you an alternative to restore the service. The services themselves, typically customers want the service underground, so they have an individual cost that comes with that typically. The customer also must have the ability to accept the underground. So if it's a masthead, it hits at the top of the house, it's really, you're talking about an electrical contractor that needs to help, so that's additional expense. Street lighting's different. Instead of overhead mast arms from a very high level, 30 some odd feet high, you've got light emanating from about 14 feet. It's pretty good for pedestrians, but it's different. But you got to make those conversions too. When what most people don't realize is that federal law actually allows the telecommunication companies to have the right to the utility pole. And so since they're federally and statutorily allowed to access, they can, if they're on the pole, they have the right to it. I can't make them leave. So even if we move our stuff off, they have to be willing to move their stuff to ultimately create the aesthetics that you want to have. So we deal with that all the time in all the jurisdictions. Something happens, a pole gets hit, and we replace it with our stuff, we move it over, and the old pole sits there. And it's got the other telecom companies, and they will get to it, but we are always urging them to move in an expeditious manner, but it takes time. But when you do underground, you got to deal with that stuff too. You got a place to put those guys. So the cost is typically about 5 to 10 times more, which is why I went back to my slide about the cost-benefit analysis. You gotta really think hard about what you want to do. If it's important and it's a place of real public interest, and that's where you want to focus on the undergrounding, that's where most municipalities that we deal with, that's how they prioritize, if you will, where they want to do some of this type of work. Next slide. Yeah, so in every franchise agreement, almost everyone, it's probably 95%, they have what they call a non-standard service fund. And it is a way to leverage a municipality's desire to provide for some undergrounding, but it provides a limited amount. So in other words, it doesn't allow for whole scale, but it does allow for selected specific projects. So it's typically a 50-50 share. So the company, upon the leverage of the municipal entity agreeing to pay for 50%, we undertake the job, the agreed upon job, on with an agreed upon design and a contract, and then once we complete the job, there's a reimbursement. But remember, you have to also consider the services, the street lighting, the telecoms, and all those things, which we try to point out as you go through the project. So municipal contributions, there's a set aside, so it's 50 basis points of the franchise fee, and the municipality provides the prioritization. If we always think reliability's a consideration, but we know municipalities, I think of it in terms of a different public interest. But we're glad to provide our input based on whatever information you want from us. You can match it with private money, it just has to be, the amount is essentially set up in the framework of the contract. So we've probably done, it's right at 60 million since 1996. The city of Charleston had the first non-standard service fund. They wanted to, we did it in their agreement, franchise agreement, which was executed in 1996. Yes, we were around back then. We worked on that agreement, and it's changed a little bit, but the same basic framework is still set up. It took a long time to get the first project done actually in Charleston. I would say Mount Pleasant has probably been the most successful entity. They did all of Coleman Boulevard. They did in front of Town Center. They did part of maybe a third, Bill, maybe not 2/3 of Mathis Ferry Road. But they leveraged this fund and basically set out, 15, 20 years ago and said, we want to do this, and this is how we're going to do it. And it's going to take a long time to do it, but we're systematically going to use it, and we're going to spend the money. And that's how they did it. And then you've had others that have tried to do it in a more, what I would describe as a more neighborhood, more prescriptive process. And they're really hard, because if you think everybody wants to do this, try to do it and try to reach consensus in a neighborhood. So we took, in the city of Charleston, a really narrow street. When you go home, Google Orange Street. So it's like a house, and it's got it's a street down in the city in the peninsula, and it goes from Broad to Trad. And 13 people, and I've never seen 13 people argue so much about undergrounding when they were going to get it all done essentially for free. So I'd warn you, if you think you could easily build consensus. They argued over a street light, position of a street light, for 2 years. So I'll just leave it at that. Next. Yeah, and so here's typical underground. You can see some of the redundancy. So this is more kind of a suburban setting on how it gets laid out, but it shows kind of the typical design. But we do a customized design for whatever we can make electrically work for what you designate as the particular area. And then I think I have a couple of visuals. Yeah, those are the types of equipment that we need access to. So if you're going to go underground, everything doesn't disappear. As I said, you've got to have switch gear, pieces of equipment where you've got to appropriately locate those. And of course, when you do that, you always worry about rising water. Daniel Island comes to mind. You would think tomato fields once, and but they still have outages there. They are predominantly underground, but when water pools up around those switchgear and people change the landscaping, it causes one of those extended, long outages that people complain about. So it's just a combination of risk and reward. We've done it for a while. We know how to do it. So I always promise people it's not everything you want it to be. It's just a balance. And so that people that many times say it's a solution, it's a solution, but it's a very focused solution for what you want to do. So I've condensed it about as quick as I can go. We're here to take any questions.
I want to echo your thoughts because where I live, right down the street, it's underground. I have a switch gear in front of my house.
Sorry, Mayor.
Well, I mean, I know they argue about where you're gonna put the switch gear, not my house, you know, that's one of the things. But a few years ago, on a hot summer night, the lights went out.
Yeah.
For 10 hours, those guys worked their butts off, running back and forth all night long, trying to figure out what the problem was. And you know, if it had been overhead, they probably would have fixed it in an hour. But it took them 10 hours of steady, hard work trying to figure out where it went bad before they finally found it. So it takes a long time, sometimes. And when I never thought about flooding because I guess where my switch gear sits is up by the street. It hadn't flooded yet. But that's another problem. Because when it comes to my house, it's flooded before.
I mean, we started thinking about it, more as there was more conversation about climate change, and it's almost like, look, if then you think there's going to be rising water, it doesn't. You need to make sure you think about that. And so, I mean, we really are having a deep conversation, on the peninsula about you guys want to spend $2 billion on a wall, and you want this stuff to go underground. Right? You sure? That's what we're trying to work, solve a problem. So I appreciate it. But the linemen are the best. I mean, those guys, they're smart guys, and they work their butt off. So they don't want to, trust me, they'd rather be home in bed anyway.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. If they could, they would be. So thank you.
You had mentioned really briefly that you do herbicide spraying. Are you doing any of that on Folly?
Bill's probably can tell you what that is.
I'm not aware of any that we're doing on Folly. Typically, that is reserved for rural right-of-ways. We do put that in the notice that we give just in case. But if you have a manicured yard, then that's not the spot that we're going to use herbicide treatment. So I'm not aware of any that will be on Folly. I just thought it would be the right thing to do to indicate that because that's just a general statement that we make. But I'm not aware of any that would be on Folly.
It's a good tool on where the bulk carriers are, where the transmission, where the right of ways are really wide, and you don't want stuff sprouting up. So usually it's a trim, and then it's the herbicide on those. It's less than as you get kind of a little bit towards the population centers, it's not a good tool. It's not a great tool.
The main thing we're trying to keep in check is anything that's going to sprout up on a volunteer basis, from the right of way. So if we can take care of that, keep it to cut to the floor, that's a better right of way.
And then as far as coming into communities like this and trimming trees, we've seen some trees where you've done what you can, but there's just a stick and a branch left. is there any option in your contract if homeowners are real upset about that to contact you and send you pictures and have you come back, and if you're just gonna leave a trunk in where the tree won't survive, to take it to the ground?
Yes, we can take it to the ground. Now, it will depend on the, and typically the reason, behind that is our forester does see that there's some life left in the tree. So, they believe that it can respond and it can sprout out. So in some cases, it may come back, in spring and the growing season. But there may be an ordinance that prevents us from doing that. So we have to always take that into consideration.
Right.
But we'll work with you, the municipality, to make that decision. Right.
If I could piggyback on that question. Greatly appreciate the work you do. I'm seeing it firsthand nearby where I live on 4th Block of East Indian. Obviously, we need to have the reliability to go along with the safety, but of course there's the aesthetic component. So to the extent that a trim is reduced, tree is reduced significantly in size, whereby you suspect it might be sent into decline, you don't necessarily want to cut it to the ground at that time. Do we have any recourse or ability to contact you a year or two after the fact to say, we thought this might happen, true to form has happened, this tree has died, now it needs to be removed at your expense versus the homeowner's expense?
Yeah, most definitely. And we do, and typically we would call that a spot trim, which would be outside of a cycle, but we do a fair amount of that. We may have a tree that just really just sprouts and is in need of trimming at the 3 or 4 year mark, so it can actually be the opposite of that. Total 180 degrees, the opposite direction, but we'll do a spot trim on it, so it could be also be removed as well.
Good to know.
I just say thank you guys for.
We do appreciate the opportunity. I know Mayor Goodwin was laughing at me when I told him that earlier, but just to try to explain what it is that we do. This is not something that's real popular, so when you come kind of barreling in, you don't really get welcome arms open, to say, come on in, let's do some more of this. But I will tell you that this is the single most important thing that we do that keeps the lights on. And the slide that Danny had up there earlier, which was the measure of SAIDI, we calculate that. We're calculating that right now. Any outage that we have, like the 10-hour that the mayor had here, we know how many customers are impacted by that, and the clock is ticking on that for us to resolve that issue as quickly as we possibly can. So the SAIDI measure that was up there, that's an acronym for really long definition, but it basically means duration of outage. So that's an average number of minutes that a customer is without power in 1 year. Now, there's 3 people in here, Mayor's gonna be one of them, and say, well, I had a really long outage and it was 10 or 12 or whatever hours, and then somebody else is gonna say, well, I didn't have any outages. So it all goes together, and we got this formula that we pull everything together and to determine that actual number right there. But that's important to us, along with safety, to make sure that we are providing you with the power that you need just to enjoy on an individual basis, or to have in terms of public service, so fire, police, for radios, pumps, anything that they have to, those staff members have to have. But we had our lowest number, which was 74 minutes of outage time 2 years ago. The one that we just had was our 3rd lowest that we've had, and it has been, the slope of that line has been negative, which is good for us and good for all of our customers, because it just means we keep the lights on for the end-use customer. And this is, it really and truly all goes to tree trimming. I can tell you right now where we're gonna be having problems when thunderstorms start in March, April, and May, based on the trim cycle that we're in. So if I've got an area that's at 4 years or 5 years, I just need to send people in that direction. I don't care if it's Mount Pleasant or North Charleston or Hanahan or Hollywood or Folly Beach. I know when it's gonna happen. That's where Folly Beach is right now. And that's what we're trying to ensure that does not happen. And certainly we do not want to have a wire down on the ground that's in a puddle of water that it's a potential hazard to someone that happens to be walking by. So that's our mission, that's our drive to make sure this is done correctly.
I'll say the worst job I ever had in the company was the day I became the electric manager, which was about 9 years after Hugo, when everybody deferred tree trimming because they thought all the trees were wiped out. And, yeah, if you think your phone rings because of tree trimming complaints, wait till you start having outages. I just left it in the office. Because, I mean, that was, because you have to catch up in order to be able to talk about somebody trimming and taking the job. You know, that's what happened. But you can't get behind on it. And we go to, Bill sends people all the time to Florida, to Louisiana multiple times this year. We see what other systems, how they operate. If you don't do the tree trimming, you won't put your system back, and it will take a long time.
So I guess that non-standard fund or whatever,
Yes, sir.
that would be something that the city would have to budget for and set up like a reserve on it. Is that something that Dominion always has the money for, or we gotta let you know we're saving, you
No,
should start saving?
we essentially set up our ledger so that we know what our obligation is to match. So as long as you guys have the money to exercise the option to get the match, then it's there.
I didn't hear anything about the cost, and I'm wondering, when you did the 13 houses on Orange Street, what was the investment? What did it take to do 13 houses in
I
Charleston?
gotta remember it almost to the dollar. It actually ended up, on that one, you gotta remember, it's highly urbanized. It's probably the most cost. But, that ended up at, $500,000. I broke it down per foot. The difference between that project and between a project we did in Country Club 1 got done, Country Club 2 is on the way to get done. But when you get in a more suburban area and you have the ability to bigger right-of-ways and places to put equipment, it's literally a 5-to-1 reduction in terms of what it costs on a per foot basis.
Orange Street was digging up asphalt.
Literally, we were in the middle of the street with concrete encased duct bank. Literally, you put conduits in and putting cables plus backup, plus the communication cables, all that goes into that job.
When you say 5-to-1, you mean?
That cost wise, yeah. So
Reduction.
instead of $100 plus per foot, you can be in the $20 per foot range.
So that job on Orange Street would be less elsewhere, less urban area.
And then lastly, what is the arrangement you have like with Riverland Terrace and the Legacy Oaks? Do they sign a waiver asking you not to trim, or do you trim less aggressively, or?
If they trim, their deferrals are catching up to them, so they've had outages now. So we're actually trying to propose an improvement to Riverland Terrace. So we can give them a cost. Their problem, or the challenge is they're partly in the city, partly in the county. The county doesn't have the mechanisms that are in the city, the non-standard service fund. So we trim for the most part regular. There's 3 areas they asked us to do specific analysis. So they don't have a great funding formula unless the city helps them or the county helps them. So the only thing they agreed to fund was to do the analysis or do the study.
But the standard doesn't change. It is the same across our systems. We use the same clearances and specifications regardless of the area.
Right.
It sure does look different though. I guess, like if you drive through it, it looks like there have not been the wedges cut in their trees.
I think bigger oaks are different, the way they end up cutting them on that Ansi standard, you cut to that leader. So it does give you it's not, the standard's not different. I think it gives you it's a different cut, different tree, different cut. An arborist could explain it better than I could, our guys could, our degree guys could, but it's a different cut. Like I see oaks that get cut, and then I see depending upon where the wire is, it looks different. Like we could go to Stocker Drive, if we do it regularly, we've done it regular the same way, but it's just the way those trees grow. They're, those bigger oaks really big oaks tend not to be as, they're just not physical, they're not, you don't see them the same way I think you see some of the other ones.
So some of the Ansi 300 trimming does come out there, so we take that leader into consideration in terms of how big it was. One of the pictures that I had was a leader that had some arcing going on. We've taken leaders this big out. I've got one in front of my office that I mounted with the burn marks on it, and you can see all the chars and everything inside there. But one example is Waku Drive, where they have the Avenue of Oaks.
Right.
That canopy is very low, so our standard pole is in many cases above that. So you don't see that. Most of the trimming is done below the neutral there, so it's not as, maybe maybe difficult or maybe adverse as you might think, because of where the conductor is
It's
located.
just a completely different look from like Riverland than it is from our east side or West Ashley.
Right.
I mean, the trees in West Ashley look as bad as ours ever did, or.
And it does depend on location, species of tree, and exactly, the configuration of the conductor. Sometimes the communication cables can look a little bit overwhelming, but the size of our conductor and where it's located is not that large. Now, that is one area that we're looking at for them, to put that underground. So we have deferred some of the trimming in there, but like Danny said, it's gonna catch up, or either, the allergies are gonna catch up with it as well. But also, like Danny said, we do get some opposition, especially because, the trees, they look really nice. If you ride through there, that's a big draw, and it has been for a long time in Riverland there. So although, if you look at some of the older pictures, it was pretty bare, when the neighborhood started. But over time, it's grown into obviously what it is there now. But I'll also tell you, we have folks that are very much in opposition to what we're doing. Others, they just want the lights on. And usually they're not gonna come out to a meeting and they're not gonna be cheering with a sign outside, there's a lot of awful pictures and things like that. They just want the lights on. And so they don't really care about underground, and they don't wanna pay any money. And so that's what we deal with here. And even when we were talking to Mayor Beckenberg on Saturday, we picked out some spots for underground equipment. I told him I'd get back to him on that to let him know how that turned out. So it's a negotiation process, and it's an easement that we have to, just like the mayor's got to the house, but we have to negotiate for that property owner. And that's what caused Orange Street to be 20 years in the making. So it's a long and involved process. We're willing to march down the road with you to try to make that happen. And like Danny indicated, we have those funds budgeted. We looked at a rolling 5 or 10 year time horizon, and we know what we spent over those past years. So it's built into our budget right now for 2021 and 10 years out. So
Appreciate that. I'm not sure it's built into ours.
yeah.
We've got some big ticket things.
Yeah, but we
our
want you,
budget now.
but we want you to be aware for planning purposes.
But you asked about the non-standard fund, we work with SCNG and now Dominion
Right.
and use our fund all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Streetlights,
Right.
going down Branch Street, streetlights on Center Street, streetlights on the bridge, all that was through the non-standard fund process. So
Yeah.
we've used over the years, we like to.
And the other work that's been done on Center Street to make that look phenomenal, with what you guys done, so far. And, we're your partner in it with you, and, that serves our substation over here. So as we did that planning to upgrade the substation, then, all of the underground was brought into it, as well. And so, that typically is the focus, because you want to try to put your dollars where the most people are gonna benefit, from that. And, I think, the mayor and council and previous councils have done an outstanding job of pointing us in the right direction, and it made sense to do streetlights to beautify the area, and that was a perfect use of the non-standard service fund.
more questions? Say we'll let the planning commission go to work. Thank you, man.
So thank you all for.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
These seats have not gotten more comfortable.
Yeah. Maybe we can get here early next time and get out the yellow chairs. They're a little more flexible.
I know.